The night Aurelio Conti was supposed to bury his father, he ended up burying something else entirely. The last illusion that the people around him were loyal. It was a private estate on the outskirts of Philadelphia, the kind of place that didn't show up on any map and wasn't listed under any name that could be traced back to the Conti family. 3 stories of pale limestone and wrought iron, surrounded by black oak trees so old they bent inward like they were listening. The funeral reception had been arranged by his uncle Sergio, who'd insisted the family gather there rather than at the church hall. "It's what your father would have wanted," Sergio had said. Something dignified, something private. Aurelio had believed him. He was 51 years old, and he had not believed anyone easily in 30 years. And yet he had believed Sergio. That would cost him. The house was full by 8 in the evening. Men in dark suits who shook Aurelio's hand with both of theirs and looked him in the eye and said our condolences, Don Conti in voices that were careful and measured. Women in black who dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs they'd barely unfolded. The Ferretti brothers had come up from Baltimore. Old Carmine De Luca had sent his youngest son in his place, which Aurelio noted and filed away. Representatives from 2 other families stood near the bar, drinking Aurelio's father's scotch and speaking quietly to each other. None of them were there for grief. Aurelio knew that. He had always known that. These events were not about the dead. They were about the living, and specifically about who among the living was going to inherit what the dead had left behind. His father had run the Philadelphia operation for 26 years. Now it was Aurelio's, and every man in that room was calculating whether that transfer of power was going to hold. He stood near the fireplace in the east drawing room, one hand wrapped around a glass of water he hadn't touched, and he watched them calculate. His left leg had been damaged 3 years ago, a car that came out of nowhere. On a Tuesday afternoon in November, a hit that was never publicly claimed, a recovery that took 8 months and left him with a limp that never fully resolved. He managed without a cane most days. On bad days, he used one and didn't apologize for it. Tonight was a bad day. His father had been dead for 4 days, and he hadn't slept properly in any of them, and the leg always got worse when he didn't sleep. He shifted his weight and watched the Ferretti brothers near the window. That was when he first noticed her. Not because she was beautiful. That was not the word anyone would have reached for. She was in her mid-20s, heavy-set, with dark hair pinned back badly, and a white catering uniform that was slightly too small across the shoulders. She was carrying a tray of small plates through the crowd with the careful, practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times, and expected no thanks for any of it. She moved along the edges of rooms, slipping between clusters of guests, keeping her eyes down and her expression neutral. She was, as far as everyone in that room was concerned, completely invisible. Aurelio watched her for a moment, not with the reflexive habit of a man who had survived this long by noticing what other people didn't. Then he looked away. 40 minutes later, he was in the study. He'd gone to get a few minutes away from the noise of the reception, to stand in the room where his father used to sit and think, and to let himself feel whatever it was that he was too controlled to feel in front of the men downstairs. He stood at the window and looked out at the dark lawn and the old oaks, and he thought about his father's hands, which had been large and steady even in the last weeks, even when everything else had started to fail. He heard voices in this hallway outside the study. He almost moved to open the door. He stopped. "Not until he's isolated," someone said. Sergio's voice. Aurelio went very still. The Ferrettis are ready to move when we give them the signal. Once Aurelio is separated from his people. What about his people? Another voice, younger. One of Sergio's sons. Maybe. His people will be offered a choice, Sergio said. The way he said it made clear what the alternative to that choice would be. Aurelio built loyalty in the old style, personally. One man at a time. That's his strength and his weakness both. Take him out of the picture and most of those men will fall in line within a week. A pause. And the funeral reception gives us cover, the younger voice said. Nobody's going to notice anything off until it's already done. That's the idea. Aurelio did not move. He stood at the window with his hand on the sill, and he let the information arrange itself in his mind with the cold precision of a man who had learned very young to think clearly in terrible moments. His uncle. His father's brother. In this house, on this night, with his father's body not yet in the ground, he needed to get out of this room without anyone in that hallway knowing he had been here. He needed to get downstairs without being intercepted. He needed to reach his own men without Sergio or the Ferrettis realizing what he knew. He moved to the desk and looked at the surface. His father's things still arranged on it, a letter opener, a ledger, a small framed photograph of Aurelio and his brother as boys. He picked up the letter opener not because it was useful, but because it was something, and he needed something in his hand. The door from the study connected to a back corridor that servants used to move between the kitchen and the upper floors. Aurelio had played in that corridor as a child, had hidden in it during his father's meetings. He went to the connecting door and opened it quietly. The corridor was dark and smelled of old wood and something cooking. Bread, maybe, or pastry. He moved along it, letting his eyes adjust, keeping his left hand on the wall. His leg protested. He ignored it. He came around a corner and walked directly into a tray of coffee cups. Or rather, the tray held because the woman holding it had fast hands and better reflexes than he'd given her credit for. The cups rattled, but nothing fell. She caught every one of them with a slight bending of her knees and a quick readjustment of her grip, and then she looked up at him with wide, dark eyes, and absolutely no sound came out of her mouth, which, given the circumstances, was the correct response. He looked at her. The cups settled. "The back exit," he said quietly. "The one that goes through the kitchen to the service entrance." "Is it clear?" She blinked. "Aye. Yes. I came in through it 20 minutes ago. But why would you? I need you to walk with me." She stared at him. "If I go through the main floor alone," he said, keeping his voice low and even, "I will be stopped. If I am walking with the catering staff, I am less likely to be stopped. I need to reach the East Garden. I have men stationed there." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her working through it. The strangeness of the request, the fact that she was 25 years old and carrying a tray of coffee cups in a dead man's house, and the most powerful criminal in Philadelphia was asking her to escort him through a kitchen. "Okay," she said. "Just that. Okay." She turned and started walking, and he followed her. Her name, he would learn later, was Dara Finch. She was 26 years old. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment in South Philadelphia, with 2 roommates and a cat that belonged to one of the roommates, but that she was the only one who actually fed. She worked for a catering company that had serviced the Conti family's events for 7 years, and she had been at approximately a dozen of those events, always in the background, always invisible, always efficient. She had recognized Aurelio Conti the moment she walked into the estate. She had kept her face neutral and her eyes down, and she had done her job, because that was what you did when you worked catering at events like this. You did not acknowledge that you recognized anyone. You did not stare. You did not engage unless engaged with. You were furniture that carried things. Walking through the dark servants' corridor with him now, she kept her pace steady and unhurried. Not slow enough to look deliberate. Not fast enough to look panicked. The tray was still in her hands. She hadn't put it down, and she moved through the corridor and into the kitchen as if she were simply returning to restock. The kitchen was loud and warm and full of the controlled chaos of catering, 2 other staff members plating desserts, the company supervisor on his phone near the door, the long steel counters cluttered with serving dishes and half-emptied trays. Nobody looked up when she came through. Nobody looked at Aurelio. They don't see him, she realized. Because I'm here. Because I'm just the help, and he's apparently with me, and nobody looks twice at the help." She walked through the kitchen and pushed through the exterior door into the cold air of the service courtyard, and Aurelio followed her, and she set the tray down on a delivery crate outside and turned to face him and said, in a low, steady voice, "The east garden is around the left side of the house. There's a boxwood hedge. If your men are where you said, they'll be past it." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, but a kind of attention that was different from before, more deliberate. "You know the layout of the property," he said. "I've worked this house before, 4 times, maybe 5. She paused. "You should go. Whoever you're avoiding, they'll notice you're missing from the reception soon." He didn't move immediately. "What's your name?" she told him. "Dara Finch," he repeated, as if filing it somewhere. Then, "You didn't ask me what was happening. I figured you'd tell me if you wanted me to know." He looked at her for another moment in the cold dark of the service courtyard, with the noise of the reception muffled behind them and the old oaks black against the sky, and he said, "Thank you." Then he walked toward the hedge. She picked up her tray and went back inside. She spent the next 40 minutes replaying it in her head while she refilled water glasses and collected empty plates. And she told herself it was nothing. It was just a strange thing that had happened, and she was fine, and she should forget it. She didn't forget it. What happened next she learned only in pieces over the following days, from fragments she wasn't supposed to hear. Overheard conversations among the company staff when they were doing the breakdown. A few lines on the local news that were careful and vague. Something a woman at her bus stop said about the Conti family. The Ferretti brothers had been asked to leave the estate before the reception ended, quietly but firmly. Sergio Conti had suffered what was being described in polite circles as a health event that required him to step back from all family business activities, effective immediately. The nature of that health event was not specified. Several men who had been affiliated with the Ferretti arrangement in Philadelphia had, within the week, made the practical decision to relocate. Aurelio Conti had consolidated his hold on the operation his father left behind, and 3 weeks after the funeral, a black car was parked outside the restaurant where Dara Finch worked her Tuesday-Thursday lunch shift. She almost didn't notice it. She was carrying 4 plates and navigating between tables, and she caught it out of the corner of her eye through the window. Black, expensive, idling. When her shift ended at 3, the car was still there. She pushed through the front door of the restaurant and stood on the sidewalk, and the rear window of the car came down, and Aurelio Conti looked out at her from the back seat. "I was told this is where you work on Tuesdays," he said. "You were told correctly." "I owe you a debt," he said, "the kind that should be acknowledged." She looked at him. She was in her work uniform, black pants, white shirt, a small grease stain on the cuff she hadn't noticed until right now. She was aware of how she looked. She was always aware of how she looked. It was one of those things that had simply always been there, the low, constant awareness, the way other people's eyes moved and where they settled and what they did. His eyes didn't move the way other people's did. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I walked you through a kitchen." "You walked me through a kitchen when you had no reason to, and several very reasonable reasons not to," he said. "That's not nothing. People who do that are rare." She didn't know what to say to that. She shifted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. "I'd like to offer you a position," he said. "Something better suited to your particular skill set." "I carry trays." "You carry trays," he agreed. "And you notice things, and you don't panic, and you don't talk when talking would be dangerous, and you moved through that kitchen without anyone looking twice. Those are not small things." She stood on the sidewalk in her work uniform with the grease stain on her cuff, and she looked at this man who ran the most powerful criminal organization in Philadelphia, who was sitting in the back of an expensive car outside a restaurant where she made $11 an hour, plus tips, and she thought about her 2 roommates and the cat she was the only one who fed, and the loan she'd taken out to cover her mother's medical bills and was still paying off at 26. "What kind of position?" she said. "Come have coffee," he said. "I'll explain." She should have said no. She knew she should have said no. She got in the car anyway. The coffee was at a place she'd never been, a small, quiet restaurant in Rittenhouse that didn't advertise and apparently didn't need to. They sat at a corner table. He ordered for both of them without asking, which annoyed her, though the coffee was genuinely very good, so she decided to overlook it. He explained what he was looking for. Not a bodyguard, not muscle, something different, someone who could be present in environments where his own men would be noticed, who could observe and report, who had the particular gift of invisibility that came not from training but from being, in the assessment of most of the world, not worth looking at. "You're asking me to be a spy," she said. "I'm asking you to do something you were already doing," he said. "At that estate, you noticed things. The layout, the staff, the exits. You noticed me before I noticed you. I saw you clock the Ferretti brothers when you were passing through the East Room." She paused. "I wasn't," she started. "You looked at them once," he said, "one glance. But you adjusted your route around them on the way back. You didn't want to be near them, which means you already knew at some level that they were a problem." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know what they were," she said. "I just knew they weren't." "Right. Something about how they were standing, who they were watching." He nodded. "That instinct is worth more than you know," he said. She looked at her coffee. She thought about $11 an hour and the loan and the roommates. "I want a number," she said. "A real one, not whatever you think I'll accept." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, more like a recalibration. He gave her a number. It was 3 times what she made in a year. She made herself take a breath before she responded, because she had learned early that the moment people saw how much something mattered to you, they adjusted accordingly. "I'll need it in writing," she said. "Not from you, from someone I can take to a lawyer." He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded. "Done," he said. She started the following Monday. The first 6 weeks were strange in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had expected to feel out of her depth. She had expected condescension from the men who worked for him, from him. She'd spent her whole life in rooms where people looked through her, and she'd assumed this would be no different, that she would be the tool that got used and then set aside. What she hadn't expected was Aurelio Conti. He was precise, he was controlled. He had the particular economy of movement that came from decades of being watched and knowing it, and he wasted nothing. Not words, not gestures, not time. He was not kind in the way that was soft or warm. He was kind in the way of a man who had survived long enough to understand that small cruelties were expensive, and he didn't spend what he didn't need to. He remembered that she took her coffee without sugar. He noticed when she limped slightly on cold days, an old knee injury from a fall at 16. And he did not comment on it or draw attention to it, but twice she found a desk chair had been adjusted to a better height on days when her knee was bad, and she was not sure if that was him or coincidence and chose not to ask. He also pushed her, consistently and without apology. He questioned her instincts. He challenged her instinct. He would sit across from her after a job and say, "What did you miss?" Not as an accusation, but as a genuine question. And the first time she'd said nothing, I covered everything. And he'd said, quietly, "The man in the blue jacket was left-handed, and you didn't account for that when you assessed the room's exit options." And she had gone back through her mental picture of the room and found the blue jacket and realized he was right. She started paying closer attention. She also started, despite every reasonable argument she made to herself, to pay closer attention to him. It wasn't something she'd planned. It was also not something she was particularly surprised by, once she recognized it. She'd spent long enough understanding that her own feelings arrived late and quiet, and needed to be found rather than felt. What she'd noticed was that she was thinking about things he'd said after the conversations were over, that she was aware of where he was in a room, that she was, without meaning to, reading his expression in the same precise way she read rooms. Looking for what was underneath the surface, looking for what was actually being said. She told herself it was professional attentiveness. She was not entirely convinced by this explanation. 8 weeks after she started, there was an evening in the late fall when they were both working late in the townhouse he used as his operational headquarters. Her going through observation notes from a meeting 3 days earlier, him on the phone with someone she couldn't hear, speaking quietly in another room. The rest of the staff had left. The building was quiet. She heard him finish the call, and she heard him come down the hall, and she heard him stop in the doorway of the room where she was working. She didn't look up immediately. She finished her sentence. Then she looked up. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and he looked, for the first time since she'd known him, tired. Not just physically, though that was there too, the shadows under his eyes, the slight tension in the set of his jaw. Something more than that. The particular exhaustion of someone who had been carrying weight for a very long time and was not going to say so. She had seen that look before, in her mother's face, in the years before the illness had a name. The look of someone who believed that endurance was the same thing as strength and had committed to the belief so completely they no longer knew what it would feel like to put the weight down. "Rough call," she said. It wasn't a question. "Rough month," he said. She nodded. She reached over to the side table where they usually kept coffee and found the carafe, and she poured a cup, and she held it out toward the doorway. He crossed the room and took it. He sat down in the chair across from her desk. Not his usual position, not the one that maintained professional distance. And he held the cup in both hands, and he looked out the window at the dark street. "My brother thinks I should get out," he said, "of all of it." She didn't say anything. "He's been saying it for 20 years, Aurelio continued. "He moved to Portland. He has a bakery. He sends me sourdough at Christmas." A pause. "He's the only person I know who I'm certain is not in any room for the wrong reasons. Is that why you trust him?" "It's one reason." He looked at his coffee. "People in this world, you spend so much time with people who are in every room for a reason. Every gesture is a calculation. Every kindness is an investment." He paused. "You start to lose the ability to recognize something that isn't that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is that what you think about me? That I'm an investment?" He looked at her. The question had come out more directly than she'd meant it to. She held his gaze because looking away would have been worse. "No," he said. "I think you're the most unsettling person I've hired in 20 years." "Unsettling," she repeated. "You're honest," he said. "Not performatively. You're honest the way people are honest when they've stopped expecting honesty to be rewarded. And you're sitting in a room with me at 10 o'clock at night. And you're not afraid of me, and you're not trying to impress me, and you're not calculating what this moment is worth." He paused. "That is genuinely strange, in my experience." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, "because you've been decent to me. People are usually afraid of you because you haven't been. That's a more charitable interpretation than most people would offer." "I'm not charitable," she said. "I'm specific. There's a difference." He was quiet. Then, very quietly, he said, "Yes, there is." The room was still. Outside, a car passed on the wet street below, headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling. Neither of them moved. "Go home, Dara," he said finally. "Get some sleep." She closed her notebook. She put on her coat. She was at the door when he said her name. She turned. "You asked me a question," he said. "Whether I think of you as an investment." He held her gaze. "The answer is no. For what that's worth." She nodded once. "Good night, Aurelio," she said. She walked home through the cold Philadelphia night, and she let herself feel what she'd been telling herself she wasn't feeling, because alone on a dark street was the only place she'd ever been able to afford honesty about things that mattered. She was in trouble, not the kind she could observe her way out of, not the kind that yielded to patience or careful attention, or all the particular skills she had built up over a life of learning to be invisible and useful and indispensable. The entirely ordinary, entirely inconvenient kind. She already knew she wouldn't do anything about it. She knew the shape of this situation too well, the distance it required, the professionalism it required, the 10,000 practical and reasonable and completely airtight arguments for why nothing could be allowed to happen here. She knew all of them. She had been building them for weeks. She also knew, walking home through the cold, that something already had. Not a grand gesture, not a declaration, something smaller, a cup of coffee held in both hands, a question asked honestly and answered honestly. Two people in a quiet room who had both, somewhere in the accumulated time of the last 2 months, stopped being careful with each other in exactly the way that mattered most. She went home. She fed the cat. She lay in the dark and thought about what he'd said. "You're the most unsettling person I've hired in 20 years." And she started to laugh quietly into her pillow. She was not the girl anyone had expected to end up here. She was not beautiful by the standards anyone had ever applied to that word in her presence. She had grown up with not enough of most things and too much of others, and she had learned to be invisible in rooms because being visible had cost her more than it was worth. But she was here, in this life, in this room, in this strange, impossible situation that she had not looked for and had not planned, and that was currently requiring every ounce of the very particular practical intelligence she possessed. She was here, and she was not invisible, and she was not being looked through. She was being seen. And Aurelio Conti, who had survived 30 years in a world that destroyed most of the people who entered it, who trusted almost no one and had excellent reasons for every one of those almost no's, had looked at her across a desk at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night and told her the truth. She thought about his brother in Portland, making sourdough. She thought about the blue jacket man she had failed to flag, and the way Aurelio had told her about the oversight, without cruelty, as a fact worth knowing, rather than a failure worth remembering. She thought about a dark corridor and a tray of rattling coffee cups, and a man who had said thank you in a service courtyard with the cold November air around them, and had meant it, and had shown up 3 weeks later, to say that meaning it had consequences. She fell asleep still thinking about it. In the morning she went to work, and she was professional, and she was precise, and she was all the things she knew how to be. But she walked into the building knowing something she hadn't known when she walked out of it last night. She walked in knowing this story wasn't over.